We've had a wonderful coffee break, thanks to the folks who have provided it. Time to get back to business, folks. If you take a couple of minutes and take your seat, we'd appreciate it. Quieted down a lot, but I still see a lot of folks we need to get back in here. Nina said she was going to be pushing folks from the back. I should push them from the front. And you're all well caffeinated now. I'm a coffee freak myself, and my daughter told me during the pandemic, or didn't tell me, she got me a t-shirt that said, "I'm caffeinated and vaccinated." I'm not sure what the two have to do with each other. Oh, y'all are a great group this morning. Normally it takes a lot more herding of the cats to get this thing back underway than it has this morning. I hope you enjoyed the speakers already, and Dr. Hainig and Andy Barr. I mean, how delightful is not the right term because they were so informative. So we want to welcome everyone back to the meeting. Our next speaker this morning is Milton Bartley. Milton is one of the region's most recognizable business leaders. He co-founded ImageQuest in 2007. ImageQuest quickly became one of Nashville's fastest growing tech companies in a high-tech city, as you know, and is recognized as a pioneer in providing managed IT, cybersecurity and IP compliance services. What more relevant topic could we have in this day and age? Please join me in welcoming Milton Bartley.
Pleasure. Thank you. There's a clicker around here somewhere. I saw it. I know it exists. It was right there. And until somebody figures it out, I can kind of wing it, I think. So we'll jump to the next slide. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back here with you this morning. I love being in front of this august group. Ballard, thanks so much for having me back. I always love being a part of this group. If you guys know where the clicker is, whoever hid the clicker, bring us the clicker. But go ahead and advance it 2 slides for me while we work on that. There we go. Here's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you about the cost of a data incident. And my job today is not to scare you. I think I've done enough of that over the past 4 or 5 years. But what I want to do today is inform you a little bit. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things. You're a bunch of bankers, so you should be able to absorb numbers. I'm going to give you some numbers, but they're really just stats to set the stage for what we want to talk about next. So, show of hands, how many of you have a cyber insurance policy? And keep your hands up if that policy pays out $6 million or more for a cyber incident. So if we jump to the next slide, let me share some data with you. And all this data, by the way, folks, is fresh 2022 data as of July 2022. So this is the average cost of a data incident at your financial institution. This is just for financial institutions in the United States, almost $6 million in cost. And a lot of you probably sit back and think, oh, I've got this cyber policy, thank goodness. If something bad goes wrong, at least I've got this backstop. And that's true. The cyber policy is critical, and it's going to do great things for you. But it's certainly not going to cover the entire cost. If we jump to the next slide, the average time that it takes us to identify and contain and remediate a breach is 277 days. 277 days, folks. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is how do we shorten that timeline? And by shortening that timeline, that's how we lower our cost and lower our risk exposure. So let's look at the next slide really quickly. Almost 20% of all of these data incidents are still stemming from somebody clicking on something they shouldn't click on inside your institution. So again, show of hands, how many of you have a consistent training program to teach people about cybersecurity awareness? A consistent program, excellent. Because that's one of the key drivers to lowering your exposure and lowering your costs. So you'll notice we talk a lot in the cybersecurity industry today. We used to stand up here and talk about how to prevent it from happening. Everything was about prevention. We're going to keep you safe. We're going to make sure this never happens to you. And that's critical. We do want to make sure that we can keep you from having an incident. But more importantly, we want to limit your exposure. We want to reduce your risk when that incident occurs. Because I think we can all accept the fact that at some point in this world we live in today, we're going to be personally impacted by one of these incidents. So you might say, well, Milton, you said you weren't going to scare us. Instead, you just came up here and gave us a bunch of bad news. So now let me give you some good news. Let me tell you how you can resolve some of this and how you can be better prepared for this inside your organization. So on the next slide, there are 3 key drivers that you need to be focused on inside your organization that can help you reduce your risk, reduce your cost, and make you a better purveyor of security for yourself, for your clients, for your community constituents. And the number 1 is security-driven automation. And the AI there stands for artificial intelligence. So don't get freaked out by this. I'm not telling you need to hire a bunch of robots to come and work in your IT department, although that may be where we end up based on today's labor shortages. But security-driven artificial intelligence and automation in the detection and in the response. So what I mean by that is in the old days, and in our world, the old days were like 2 years ago. In the old days, we relied on an alert. And then your IT team, whether that's your internal team or your third-party partner or your external vendors, to actually respond to those alerts and determine, hey, is that something we really need to deal with? Do I really need to shut down that computer, remove it from the network? Well, with security artificial intelligence automation, those decisions are made for you in milliseconds. Drastically cuts down our time to respond, drastically cuts down the ability for bad things to spread across the network to other devices. So that's number 1. Number 2, on the next slide, having an incident response plan that gets tested. How many of you test your incident response plan once a year? Because the FFIEC says you must. I should see all your hands, right? How many of you test it more than once a year? How many of you have a consistent quarterly testing plan where you go through different pieces and parts of your incident response and you look at different types of scenarios? How many of you participate in the statewide response exercises where your state regulators put on a combined exercise for you and help you work through how would you respond and how would you react? Well, folks, I can tell you, if you are consistently testing your incident response plan, not just once a year so that you can say we did it and put it in an artifact so that an auditor or an examiner can look at that piece of paper sometime down the road, but if you make this part of your culture, you can reduce your time to recovery and your total expense by 45%. And then the third driver, and this is going to be where I start talking about voodoo, is this zero trust network access. How many of you have ever heard of zero trust? ZTNA. It's one of these cutting-edge terms in cybersecurity. And what's interesting, if this were a room full of cybersecurity experts, I would be loath to stand up here and talk about zero trust because there are about 100 different definitions of zero trust. And none of them are going to agree on it. They're just going to stand up here and make fun of me for even bringing it up. But in this type of a group, it makes a lot of sense to talk about. And the reason you want to embrace a zero trust is because it really is the only way you can be sure of who is accessing what on your systems and in your network. So these are all things that I think are great statistics, but let's bring it down to the real world for Kentucky bankers. And let's look at the next slide, and let's talk about what you should be doing. So this layered security approach slide, if nothing else resonates with you today, this is really your takeaway, to take this one slide. Take a copy of it. You'll all have a copy of this in your packets afterwards. Take a copy of this and take this back to your IT leadership. Take it back to your technology steering committee. Take it back to your outsourced security partner, depending on how you do this. And ask them intelligent questions about this. So let's look at each of these really quickly. I talked about the zero trust network access. I can tell you the best thing about zero trust, most people hear it and they're like, zero trust? How many of you love VPN? Raise your hand if you love VPN and you love to connect to VPN. Well, what if I told you if you properly deployed a tool like Zero Trust, you'd never had to use VPN again, but you would be afforded the same level of security and protection, actually more so. Yeah, that is pretty sweet. Managed detection and response. A lot of you have heard the term SIEM. Your regulators, your examiners ask you, are you deploying a SIEM? Do you use a SIEM? Are you doing log aggregation? Are you looking at your logs? And you're like, I don't know. You go ask the IT person, are we looking at our logs? And they're like, yep, we're looking at our logs. But are you really? And this, by the way, is where artificial intelligence can start to play a role. And so if you go to the next, AI-enhanced security operations center. So again, this not the next slide, sorry, we're staying on that slide for the rest. The artificial intelligence enhanced SOC, or Security Operations Center. So none of you, I can promise you, I can't imagine a bank in this room that is going to invest in building their own cybersecurity operations center with 24/7 by 365 eyes on glass in your facility. I can't imagine that investment taking place in this room. If it is, I want to talk to you. But the reality is you're going to outsource that to someone, whether that's outsourcing it to a partner like an ImageQuest or a Louisville Geek or one of these other managed service partners in the room, or whomever else you happen to be working with. But artificial intelligence plays such a critical role there. And you want to ask the questions of your IT team. Are we using AI-enabled tools? A lot of people refer to this as like next gen or next generation. I despise that term, but it is an industry term. But allowing the algorithms to make some of the decisions for us and letting us respond faster and be more on top of incidents before they can spread throughout your network and across your data. And we do the same thing with vulnerability management. And vulnerability management it's a double-edged sword. So a lot of you probably don't have vulnerability management in your banks, but you probably do an annual vulnerability scan. Your auditors or your auditors who do your IT audit every year, part of that audit is going to be a vulnerability scan. They're going to scan your network both internally and externally. It's a one-time scan. It's a day in time. It's a point in time. But the reality is your network changes every second, every minute, every hour, every day of that year. So by doing it once a year, or even once a quarter if you're more august, you're only still getting a fraction of the protections. And so looking for an AI-driven vulnerability management tool that literally is scanning your network all the time, in real time. Now, the good news of that is you get great information and it's at your fingertips every day. The bad news of that is the only thing worse than not knowing you have a vulnerability is knowing you have a vulnerability, because now it's incumbent upon you to go rectify it. Now you have to remediate. Not that you don't want to remediate anyway, but having that real-time assessment and knowing what's going on means you now have to have a plan and a strategy to remediate that, not just once a year, when you get the report, so that you can put it in your findings book and report back to say, look, they found 3 things and we fixed them. This is going to happen every day, and it should happen every day, because the vulnerabilities are how the bad guys get in. Next is endpoint detection and response. That's a really fancy term for antivirus. And again, the industry a lot of times likes to use the terms next gen antivirus, the next generation. I like to talk about the artificial intelligence enhanced endpoint detection and response. And the critical piece of that is the R, the response. All antivirus software is detection, but you need it to actually respond. And that's, again, that instantaneous reaction. Let me give you a real-world example. If you're on your computer and you have traditional antivirus and you're sitting in your office or wherever you happen to be and something bad happens on your computer and you get the pop-up message in the bottom right corner maybe, or maybe in the center of your screen that says, XYZ has detected some kind of behavior on your computer. It lets you know. And if you have a fairly sophisticated IT shop, it's probably also letting your IT folks know at the same time. It's opening a ticket for you with your help desk, whether that's internal or external. And then a human being has to look at that alert and make a decision and say, oh, okay, well, I saw this pop up on Milton's computer. Yeah, that looks legit. I better call Milton, and we better shut down some things. Meanwhile, that could have been 2 minutes, 8 minutes, 10 minutes. Thank you very much. You got it. Thanks. An hour, 2 hours, depending on your response time and the load. But if you have it automated, things happen instantaneously. I still get the alert, but immediately my computer can be isolated from the network so that it can't spread information or take on additional information. it can immediately be locked down so that I can't do any more harm unintentionally until a human can then look at it and make a decision. That's the R piece of EDR. And by the way, if any of you filled out a cyber application in the last 12 months, you've been asked these questions. They're asking you, do you have active endpoint detection and response? And a no answer to a lot of these questions may not have been cause to not renew your cyber insurance in the past, but I can assure you it will be in the future. These things are coming. The next thing that's really critical is password management. I was talking with a banker last night, and he was telling me the story about the complex passwords he used and how often they change it, and he has to remember this, and he can't use the same one for the last 18 times or 24 times, and he's always trying to remember, well, did I use my father's maiden name? Did I use my mother's maiden name? I can't remember which one I used. And I think we've all been there, right? And so what I've said for years is you should invest in a password management tool and make it available to your employees and make it a part of your culture. And I have said this is really good advice to you. This is something I highly recommend to you. Today I would stand here and tell you if you're not doing it, this is one of the things you should go back to your IT team and say, hey, how do we control passwords starting next week, next month, next quarter? How do we make this an initiative before the end of 2022? It's such an easy, low-cost thing to do that will dramatically change the security posture inside your organization, and it'll make your employees' lives so much easier. You know how many passwords they have to know to do their job every day? It's nuts. And we have these tools at our fingertips. The next is data loss prevention. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but it means just what it says. It's the ability for you to monitor data leaving your network, leaving your ecosystem, and to prevent unauthorized access of that data. How many of you use Office 365? I would say many, many, many of you do. It's a free built-in feature of Office 365. Most people don't know that it exists. And it's already pre-built with FFIEC triggers. So literally your IT team can set up that data loss prevention tool inside your email ecosystem and your Teams ecosystem and your SharePoint and your OneDrive if you're using those tools. Really, in a matter of minutes, they can turn that on and at least begin to see the flow of data. And then if they decide to or you decide to, you can flip a button that actually stops the ability to send data outside that triggers something off of that FFIEC list, like account numbers, like wiring instruction information and things like that, that should be encrypted when they leave your system. Next is application whitelisting. Means just what it sounds like. I've got all these applications that run on my computer, and if I have an application whitelisting tool, by the way, who here is afraid of ransomware? Who wants ransomware? Nobody wants it. Several of you are afraid of it. That's good. So, you know how ransomware runs? It acts like a computer program that's supposed to run on your computer. Really sophisticated ones act like a real program, act like part of Windows, act like part of Adobe, act like an update. If you have an application whitelisting tool deployed on your network, that can't happen. The application whitelisting tool knows what Adobe looks like when it runs, and when it tries to do something crazy, it says, whoa, wait a minute, you can't do that. It's a great protection, and again, fairly inexpensive tool. And then these last two are really process-driven, and the first one I would tell you is rigorous vendor management, and we're probably going to talk about that here in a few more minutes, but what are IT examiners asking for in 2022 and 2023? Man, they are digging deep on your vendor management protocols. They're digging deep on your third and fourth party vendors. They're digging deep on vendors that have access to your data through the cloud, through API connectors, through your core and other things that are happening. So making sure that you have a very solid, rigorous program. And then the last one is that tested incident response program, making sure that you're not just doing it once a year so you can say, yep, we did it, but you've actually built a culture around testing for bad things to happen. I mean, can you imagine if you had your school-age children and they only did a fire drill test on the first day of school and they never tested it again for the rest of the year? How well do you expect them to behave in February when a real fire happens? Are they going to remember what they learned in August? Of course not. We're no different than those children. We have to go through this testing protocol on a consistent basis, and we have to get the right people in the room when we do it. Because guess what? Bad things will happen, and when bad things happen, that is not the time to experiment and learn. So with that, I'll leave it on this slide, and I think we'll sit down and have a little chat. Thank you so much.
Milton, The crooks seem to always be ahead of the good guys. How do we reverse that?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't know that you'll ever get ahead of the crooks, right? You're going to play leapfrog with the crooks,
Yeah.
and it's going to be, we figure it out, they figure it out, we figure it out, and they figure it out. But what we're going to do, hopefully, is take away the stigma of cybersecurity for people like the bankers in this room that feel like, oh my gosh, I can't even think about this. I've got to go talk to my IT people because they're the only ones that can understand this. And I think we've created this mystique, this aura around cybersecurity. I don't know why we did it as an industry. Maybe it's job security. I really don't know. Where we make it feel like you have to have all these special credentials and these special initials after your name to even entertain this conversation. So part of this, I think, is really getting folks in this room and your peers to understand that this is all of us. This is the world we live in today. And we all have to embrace and understand it. And that's why I try, and I hope I'm doing a good job, I try to keep it simple and keep the concepts simple that you can grasp and understand.
What's your biggest worry? The kid sitting on a couch in his mother's basement, or a foreign actor?
Foreign actor, hands down, no questions asked.
What have you seen in that regard?
Well, I mean, if you pay attention to any of these major incidents that have affected us, so I'll throw some names out that you probably know: Colonial Pipeline, Solar Winds, Kaseya. I mean, these are all well-known incidents. These aren't the kid in the mom's basement, right? These aren't the kid eating Cheetos, drinking Red Bull and playing Xbox. These are nation-state actors, probably, I have no inside information on this, but probably funded and supported by their governments, right? And so they have a dual mission. Mission one is, how do we go exploit and make money? And mission two is, how do we disrupt the United States of America?
Can we actually stay ahead and prevent a very sophisticated attack from a nation state?
Well, when you say we, I'm assuming you mean we euphemistically, not we like a single community bank, right?
Correct.
So yeah, I believe we can, and I think largely we've done an amazing job. So I think if you really were to compare this, and I'm going to draw a parallel that's not exact, but if you think about post 9/11, right, and the fact that we haven't had a major, terrorist incident on U.S. soil, and you think about all of the things that have had to go into place for that to happen. And nobody wakes up in the morning and calls over to the White House and says, hey, great job, guys, we made it another night. Appreciate you taking care of us, right? We only hear about the bad things.
Right.
Our world is much the same. So I think we as a country have made great strides, but so many of these things, as you realize, still rely on a human, social engineering, someone doing something they shouldn't do, either maliciously, but more likely doing it non-maliciously, where they're simply taking a shortcut to their job, or we didn't put a good control in place to keep them from doing something. And so they're like water. Human beings are like water. We're going to go to the lowest and easiest level. And sometimes that is, well, I just clicked on the link, and we didn't have anything to stop them from clicking on the link.
You shared a lot of information with us about how to protect ourselves
Right.
and our companies. If there are one or two things from a security standpoint, one or two things the bank has not implemented, what would you say do it immediately?
Yeah, great question, Jay. I would say there's a couple of things that I would put top of mind, and it's for three reasons, really. Number one is these are things that are actually going to improve your safety and security, so they marginally will make you safer. Number two is these are things that regulators are going to be looking for and asking questions about when they come see you. And number three is your cyber insurance carriers are not just asking, they're now demanding that you do some of these things. So number one is, I mentioned endpoint detection and response. Make sure that you're not just using a regular antivirus software, that you're using a true automated tool, and you're allowing and encouraging your IT team to turn those tools on so that it will actually do what it's supposed to do. I've run into companies, Jay, where they'll go pay for and install this great piece of software, but then they're like, you know what, if we're afraid if we flip that switch and it automatically locks things down, that might cause a disruption over in the office one day, and I don't want to get yelled at, so they leave it turned off in monitor-only mode, which is no better than just buying or using the free antivirus that comes with your computer. So that's number one. I would look at endpoint detection and response. The second thing I would look at before I did anything else is I would look at a password management tool. The loss or theft of an employee's credential is still almost 80% of the time.
How does that most frequently happen?
Well, it can happen lots of ways. I mean, it happens with, you get an email that says, hey, Milton has sent you an encrypted message. You know Milton. And so to get the encrypted message, you've got to go through the link. He's your cyber guy, that's right. And so you click on the link that came from someone you think you trust, and it asks you to put in your email address and your Microsoft password, because that's how you go get a Microsoft encrypted message. And it turns out that Milton never sent you an email. Yeah. And you've just now given your password to the bad actors. Now, the way around that, by the way, is have two-factor authentication turned on all your email, and then that will prevent that. It doesn't stop you from giving it to me, but it stops me from using it once you do. And then I think the third thing that to me is critical is having a good vulnerability management strategy. That doesn't mean going out and buying some big piece of software and deploying it and then going and hiring 3 people to manage this. It really starts with a technology steering committee meeting and an intelligent discussion about, what are we doing today? Okay, well, we do a once-a-year vulnerability scan when our IT auditors come in. And we take that vulnerability report and we go work through it and we report it back in our findings, and we kind of put a bow on it and we say we're good for the year. If that's what you're doing, great. Talk intelligently with your team of how you can take that to the next level. The next level doesn't mean tomorrow let's turn on daily scanning. It may mean, hey, let's do this once a month. And let's try to do this 12 times a year instead of once a year. And let's get a handle on the remediation. Because the remediation, and by remediation, what do I mean? It's simply patching. But it's not just as patching like, hey, push a button and your Windows machine patches. There's patching on the server level. There's patching on the software side that's not automated, and it's not always easy. But if you can turn that into a monthly exercise instead of an annual exercise, I think you can make a lot of headway. And then maybe your next step is, hey, now we're going to move to some type of a daily scan.
Cyber insurance is obviously an additional operational cost. How does the pricing of cyber coverage reflect the security of a particular institution?
That's a great question. And I don't know how many of you have renewed your cyber insurance this year and seen a market increase. I did. We carry a big amount of cyber insurance. We have to in the business we're in. And, we've had is there something I can knock on? We've had no incidents to report, no claims to make, and that didn't stop us from getting a 68% increase this year. And that reflects the market in general. And so we're seeing these cyber rates go up, and we're actually seeing cyber insurance providers exit the market. We're seeing large names that you would recognize say, you know what, we're not going to do cyber policies any longer. Or, hey, I've seen this a lot, we're not going to offer cyber policies to healthcare companies. Because, by the way, you're number 2, we're number 2, financial institutions are the second highest cost of an incident and the second volume of incidents. Number 1 is healthcare. And so we've seen wholesale, big brokers exit the healthcare industry. And so what you're going to see is they've been asking these questions for years. And again, if some of you filled these out, you remember 2 years ago, you had a 2 or 3 page questionnaire. Today, you get a 17-page questionnaire. And they're really digging into the weeds. And now they're not just saying answer the question, they're saying, okay, show it to me. I want to see a copy of how you do Active Directory. I want to see your policy that you told me you have. And so if you're not able to produce those things, that doesn't mean you won't get insurance, but one of 2 things will happen. You're going to pay more for it, and we've had banks where this has happened to them, we'll give you your $3 million policy. You're going to pay the $3 million premium, but we're only going to give you $1 million worth of coverage until you can cure these 3 things on the list. And so now the things that you said you're not doing, they're not going to give you full insurance coverage until you fix those things.
How do you recommend that you mentioned 3rd and 4th party vendors. How do you recommend that we as banks deal with those vendors in terms of how do we audit an outside party?
Well, that's a great question, and there's no magic answer to it. It really does require rolling up your sleeves, asking intelligent questions of your vendors, consistent intelligent questions.
Is that something you can help us with?
That is something we could help you with, yes. And there are others in this room that can do that. I mean, we use the InContracts platform with our bank. So if we were doing it for you, we would use Inventor. and we would rely on them as a two-way partnership to do some of that work. But there's no easy way, there's no button you can push. You can't just go hire a vendor tomorrow and then magically your vendor management's done. You still have to go ask the questions, and then you have to know what the answers mean when they come back, right?
Not just have the answer sheet back, but actually.
You have to understand what it means and how to ask more intelligent questions once they respond to that first set of questions, because that's how you're really going to figure out who's at risk. And I will tell you, folks, FinTech is fantastic. I'm a huge fan of it. But let's be real and honest here. A lot of FinTech is venture capital backed. It is bootstrapping. It is entrepreneurial, which I love. That's how I built my business. But that means they're going to do, in many cases, only what someone requires them to do. And I have had conversations with FinTechs where I've asked them the question, and they're like, well, we don't really have that document. You're the first person that's ever asked us that. And we're like, that can't be true. You only work with banks. I have to believe that others are asking you these questions.
I got to tell you, probably the reason why your premium went up is you weren't dealing with Chuck Maggard at the KBA for cybersecurity insurance. I'm just saying, you might want to check that out.
That could be the case, Ballard.
However, all of this stuff you're talking about, I mean, it boils down to resources, cash, money, people, and there's not every bank in the country can afford to do this. What choices do they have? Where do they turn? What do they do?
Well, there's a couple of things, Ballard, and so it's not just about the cash resources sometimes. Sometimes it's about the intellect and the intellectual capital that you need in the room. And unfortunately, we have a dearth of that across the United States, right? It's not just in the rural communities where it's even harder to find good talent and bring them in and get them excited about staying. Even in Nashville, which is one of the 5 or 6 tech hubs of the country right now and one of the hot spots, it is hard to find good people, and it's even harder to keep them. So I would say, one of the ways that community banks, especially non-fiducia, sub $1 billion community banks can do this is to work with a third-party partner that does this and take it as a fractional share. So share those resources with 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 other banks through a partnership, and that I have seen to be very effective.
So are there, and on co-ops like that, are there firewalls consistent with what a bank would want as far as these are my customers?
That's correct, yes. And so when you work with someone that does that for a living, I mean, they're under the same compliance and regulatory scrutiny that you are as a bank, right? And so they have to be doing the same things. In many cases, if you're asking good questions through vendor assessment and vendor due diligence, they have to be doing it as well or better than you can do it, right? Otherwise, why would you want to partner with them and have them come into your bank? I've seen that to be very successful. And even in fiducia, greater than $1 billion banks, we've seen that work. And not just in Kentucky. I mean, we personally have large banks that we work with around the country to do some or all of this work for them.
You had a slide earlier about $6 million average cost of a breach.
Right.
I mean, at our bank, it's hard to get a penny out of our management team, but when it comes to security, you just can't say no. You got to do your due diligence.
Right.
You can't say no on the cybersecurity. Let's switch gears here a bit. Go to regulators, examiners. Look into the future a little bit, maybe just at 2023. Any hot buttons you see from examiners as it relates to IT?
Yes, so one of the things I'm already starting to see, and so in my position, uniquely, I get to work with all of the regulatory agencies, not all the states, obviously, but I get to work with the OCC, I get to work with Federal Reserve banks from multiple different constituencies, I get to work, obviously, with the FDIC and the state regulators in many of our states. What we're starting to see in late 2022, and I certainly anticipate into 2023, is a deeper scrutiny on your IT controls around data protection and privacy. And what I mean by deeper scrutiny is they're not just asking you the question and checking out your board minutes or your meeting minutes to make sure you discussed it. They want to see the reports. So if any of you greater than $1 billion banks have been through fiducia and been through some of that, what I'm seeing is that, because that's a higher level of scrutiny around data controls, right? Don't just tell me that you looked at the Active Directory reports, show me copies of the reports, show me the screenshot of where you pulled that data. They want to see these things. I'm seeing that being pushed down to all banks, regardless of your size. And so you really have to be able to prove that you're doing the things that you're doing, or doing the things that you say that you're doing. And that doesn't mean that people are answering the question yes and they're not doing it. What it means is you may not have the best procedure and the best repeatable process for that, but you're still answering the question yes because at some point during the year you did it. Now they're going to want to see, show me March, show me June, show me September, and I want to see the actual report, and I want to see the screenshots of you pulling those reports. I see a lot of that.
Are we seeing this more in safety and soundness exams or compliance exams?
I'm seeing it more in safety and soundness exams, but that doesn't mean it won't exist on the other side as well.
You mentioned the real danger from nation-state actors. We're talking about third and fourth party vendors. Then we come up to the bank. Then we come up to the software provider to the bank. Aren't the nation-state actors sometimes finding vulnerabilities in the software that we bought from others?
I would say yes. So think about it. So put your, change the chair for a second and think that you're the nation-state actor, you're the bad guy. Do you want to have to figure out how to get into 1,000 banks?
Yeah.
Or do you want to have to get into a single piece of software that gives you the back door into 1,000 banks? That's a pretty simple answer, right? So that's where they're going to spend their time and energy and effort.
We're obviously aware of I think the pipeline case was one of those.
Absolutely, it was.
Yeah.
And SolarWinds was the same way, which affected so many of our organizations, not just us, right? And I'm not here to do a CSI commercial because a lot of people did this well, but I will just say.
Yes, you are too.
Okay, I am. I own 0 stock in CSI, although I wish I'd owned some 2 Mondays ago. But Steve Sanders, who is their Chief Information Security Officer, I think he is one of the absolute best communicators in our industry from an information security standpoint. When something is happening in the world that affects our bankers and affects our software, I think he and his team do a phenomenal job of getting out in front of it, of addressing and saying, here's what we're doing, here's what we're seeing, here's what we think you should be doing, here are the questions you should be asking your other vendors. I love that. And I just think they do a phenomenal job of that. But that's the key, is we have to hold those vendors accountable. And holding those vendors accountable means you have to know what questions to ask, which comes back to my original answer of everybody in this room needs to be a cybersecurity specialist in some way. That doesn't mean you're going to go out and do a pen test and program some device. What it means is you understand the language and you can have an intelligent conversation about it with your technology leadership and not be afraid or ashamed because you don't know the answers.
But how do we do something? We're upgrading to Windows 11 for business. How do we go to Microsoft?
So you're asking about Microsoft security per se?
I mean, would they even listen to us if we had a question?
Well, so they're not going to listen to you, but here's the great thing about Microsoft is they know you're going to ask this question. Yeah. They've already answered it. So they've provided this information for you in advance. Yeah. You just have to go find it. They do a really good job of explaining, here are all the security controls we've got in place. And here's how they, by the way, tie back to NIST, which ties back to the FFIEC. So you can really easily map, well, I want to do this, and the FFIEC is going to ask me these 10 questions. Here's how I answer those 10 questions for Microsoft.
I had the opportunity to have dinner not long ago with one of our top security people in the government, and the question about cybersecurity came up. We had some bankers in the room, and he said basically, they don't come after you because you've got a lot of walls up. They go after the easier people first. Mm-hmm. So the harder it is to get in, the less they're going to come after you after they've hit everybody else. But one of the questions that came from one of the banks was this: the algorithms with blockchain have been around a long time. The algorithms have been around a long time. The name blockchain is sort of new, but you see a lot of hacking of cryptocurrencies and things like that. How is that going to play in the banking industry when they start combining those two together?
I don't have the answer to that, Ballard, but I share your same concern because I fundamentally believe that the only thing that is not hackable is the computer that doesn't exist or that's encased in concrete at the bottom of the Kentucky River or the Marco Island Sound. I guess we could be geographically specific, but I do believe someone's going to figure it out one day. You asked the first question, what about the bad guys? They're ahead of us. They're smart. They're hiring people that are just as smart as we are. They're learning the same things we're learning just as fast, sometimes faster. It bothers me, and I hope we have the right amount of scrutiny around it and we don't chase it like the shiny new object and tie everything to it before we've figured out that, hey, it may be great And it is great in some respects, but it's not perfect, and it's not unalterable.
I've heard that Ethereum is behind a change in the blockchain structure, going to a proof of work model. Are you aware of what's going on there?
Yes, and if you have Coinbase, by the way, you know your system is going to go down tonight at 8 p.m. Pacific time while they make some of these changes. Yes, so they're doing this, and again, all these things tie together, right? I believe this is an ESG play, believe it or not. Going to the proof of work will dramatically reduce the amount of electrical energy required to process and monitor these transactions.
I heard like 99%.
Yeah, it's crazy what it's going to do. Like the electricity to just approve one, or I guess not approve isn't the right word, but to go through one Ethereum coin validation today is X, and you're right, it's going to be, after the proof of work concept, it'll go down to 0.1X.
Do you see us working with that in the future?
I wouldn't say I don't see a specific one, although I would tell you, I do think that the Ethereum platform has positioned themselves well, especially a lot of the fintech folks out there. That's the platform that has become more universally adopted than others. Bitcoin has its place, and it gets, it's the 100-pound gorilla, but the Ethereum platform is the one that so many of these other players are coding against, writing applications to talk to. When you hear about this NFT, a lot of the NFT work takes place on the Ethereum blockchain. So I believe it's well poised to be a sustainer, where I think there's thousands of blockchains and tools out there. I don't believe that all thousands of those will make it.
Well, it looks like in the next several years, we as bankers will probably be taking digital currency as collateral in a controllable electronic record. So this is something we'll have to deal with.
Absolutely, and we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that just like everything else we do, there's a risk to it. And if there's money involved, there will be bad people trying to figure out how to get to it.
Well, when you're banks, you have the money.
That's right.
Why did Jesse James rob banks?
Well, if he's around today, he'd rob an insurance company, but
that's right.
Neither here nor there. But you were talking earlier about other banks getting together and co-opting some cybersecurity issues. Do you have examples of that out there where you have 10, 15, 20 banks that have gotten together and said, look, we're all going to put up X number of dollars, it's all going to work, we've got the firewalls to protect our customer base?
Yes, I don't have a specific example, Ballard, but I can walk you through how I've seen this conversation take place in another state, where you've got a small group of bankers from that state who have their own little consortium, if you will, almost a subset of the KBA, if you want to put it in that perspective. And they've figured out, hey, we represent these 11 rural counties in XYZ state, and the average population of one of our counties is 26,000 people. And we have a real struggle with finding, hiring, and retaining good talent. And we're not going to be able to go to a big market and bring in this information security officer level person, and we can't afford them, and B, they don't want to move to our county with 26,000 people. And so what they can do is they can work together as a consortium, and they can bring that person or that organization in and let that organization provide the guidance and collaborate with that entire group of banks to layer the same type of security, that consistent security platform across those banks. And they can then get a lot of cost savings on any of the things they need to buy, right? Because now I'm not one little bank in XYZ County trying to go negotiate with, I'll use Microsoft, this is a bad example, but we'll use it. Now I've got 20 banks that are trying to negotiate, so now I have a lot bigger buying power when I try to go buy these things.
Does that mean that all of those banks have to have, for lack of a better phrase, the same arrows in the quiver? In other words, you can't have a yellow arrow whenever, they all have to be red.
I don't think it's that defined. I think you can figure that out on your own, but I would say that it would be helpful if you all use the same core, right? Because a lot of that's going to tie back to the core. But even that I don't think is as critical anymore, because the same principles of security apply whether you're on Jack Henry or FIS or Fiserv or CSI or something else. The same principles of security apply whether you host it on premises or whether you let them host it for you. It's just a matter of who's doing the work.
We thank you for being with us today, sir.
It's a pleasure.
Not everyone is supposed to make us happy. Some folks are supposed to scare us. And you have sufficiently done that. So.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, gentlemen,
you,
having me
Milton.
up here with you
Appreciate
today.
it.
Thank you.